Kenneth's up there. So what I heard Rorty saying, I knew Rorty, and so we were friends. What he wanted to do was enforce a Deweyan view, a pretty thick John Deweyan view of democracy on people, and that just felt oppressive to me. But you raised the really important question, of course. Can we eliminate everything of that sort? Won't there be a moral gap? Which in a way goes back to the fear of all these people. I mean, what do you mean a state which is not unified by which does not have some sort of religious moral unity in the people? Now, so a liberal democracy is clearly not a neutral arrangement. I mean, it's obviously got commitments. I think it's got deep commitments to human rights. And if somebody thinks that there are no human rights, then they've got real trouble with a liberal democracy. So I said the accusation is that it's amoral. I don't believe that. In fact, it is a moral structure of its own sort, very different from previous ones, but it's not an amoral structure. But I think on lots of issues that we debate, we live with the reality that we don't have shared structural principles, but we live with the reality that we don't have shared principles which are going to yield consensus. The present health care debate is messy because it's filled with so many economic complications and so forth. I think the cleanest illustration of this point was the debate over physician-assisted suicide, which took place in the state of Oregon about 15 years ago. Economics was not, well, I mean, a few people raised an economic issue. It's just too expensive to take care of old people, but by and large that. And what you found was a whole. I was in an election, we won that one. And what you found was a whole array of fascinatingly articulate but different moral positions coming out. Not one secular one, not one religious one. There was no religious person who was so heavy-handed as to say, God told me last night that physician-assisted suicide is wrong, so it is, and that's the end of the matter. Nobody was so flat-footed as that. You had utilitarians, and you had these economizers who said it's just too expensive to take care of old people and so forth. What we do at the end of the day is take a vote. We haven't achieved consensus. We take a vote, and that's a mighty risky procedure. Do you know of a better one?
No, I think that's right. My question.
What's the option? Somebody's going to force uniformity?
My only concern is that how do we ensure that people respect there being a vote, for instance? Is that something that we just assume that people will always say, "Oh, well, let's go to a vote"? That seems to me something that does require particular cultivation and such, and I'm concerned that you saying we shouldn't traffic in the business of comprehensive doctrines runs the risk of us getting to a point where the vote is not what we in fact go back to.
So I think we have to pay a lot of attention to the character of the preliminary debate. Things that Tony said, things that I said, a lot of attention to that. Then, and one of the reasons that each of us should listen to the voice of the other is so that when we decide to vote against them, finally, against their position, we know what we're voting against. We are voting against Joe, who has expressed with great eloquence his own, whatever, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist position, whatever. And now I find I still disagree with him, and I have to vote against him. I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to allow these voices to come forth. So we know, if I'm voting against Joel, I know who it is, what position it is that I'm actually voting against. But then we have to take the vote and try to make that vote as fair as possible. So here's what's guiding people like Audi and Rawls and so forth. A noble vision of a society in which all of us are co-authors of the legislation. We are co-authors. Nobody's handing it down, we are co-authors. That's the basic idea. And if you're a co-author, you're not coerced, right? Perforce. I think that's a noble idea. It just doesn't work.
But I think you disagree, right, that you need to nurture a certain procedures, and that within those democratic procedures there are values and virtues
Absolutely.
embedded, right?
And
so that there are substantive virtues embedded in the various democratic setup,
Exactly.
right?
We got to
what
talk about the
which is what
virtues
you're pushing.
of the
Yeah.
process and the debate. Absolutely. And
Right.
my lament is that we're violating those virtues flamboyantly in the U.S. today.
Right, right.
So I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I think it's. So I was thinking about debates and over the vote and so on, and various views that are put forward. There was a when you lead a political party, basically you are the recipient of a lot of advice, and of varying degrees of sense. And the first leader of the British Labour Party was a Scots guy called Keir Hardie, who's a very tough-minded guy, but he was trying to get the party off the ground to win support in an election. And this was before women's suffrage. And the Pankhurst sisters, who were campaigning for women's suffrage, they'd also, another part of their work was they studied the incidence of various sexual diseases, and they'd come to the conclusion this was all because of the proclivities of men. And they wrote, the sisters wrote to Keir Hardie, who was the leader, and said, before the election, they said, we would like to put forward the following proposition to you, that you campaign on a slogan of votes for women and abstinence for men. To which Keir Hardie replied, he said, thank you very much for your advice, the election-winning propensities of which are not immediately discernible. So, don't know why I mentioned that, but anyway. I think, you see, I think that I think Nick made a very important point about the preliminary debate, at least, has got to be drawn in a very careful way. You see, I mean, Nathan was asking me for practical examples. I mean, just to give a couple. I started a program of schools in the UK, slightly similar to your charter schools, but they were called the academy system, which is now, developed in a major part of our secondary school system. But there was a major philanthropist who wanted to start such schools up in the Northeast, and who was a creationist. And the question arose whether, as a creationist, it was right that he could start these schools because of the influence on the children. In the end, sometimes at the cusp of these things, you have to decide it in quite a difficult way. So we decided in the end, I decided he should be able to start those schools, but he could not teach creationism as he could not contradict the curriculum. Now, you need, I think, to have to get this attitude of mind. I don't think you can leave it to chance. I mean, this is where I agree with what Kenneth was saying. And so I believe, for example, that because of the importance today, this is the reason for this course, and the reason I think why education policy has got to take account of the fact that religious and faith literacy today is an important part of understanding the society and world in which you grow up. And therefore, I think that needs to amend, the policy that we have. Now, does that mean that everybody will agree? No. And does that mean occasionally, as with Switzerland, that you end up in a situation where people collectively take an action that is contrary to to really what the country is about, actually? No, it doesn't mean that. You will get that. But that makes it all the more important for that open attitude to be, I think, quite a deliberative proposition advanced on behalf of the.
Does Switzerland have a constitution?
It does have a constitution, but the constitution tends to focus more on the sort of technical, division between the powers of the central government and the cantons and so on. Although it does have human rights legislation. Now, I think one thing that is interesting is this, and this, both Alan's point and Ruta's points to this, I think, that there will inevitably be situations in which there's a conflict, right? I mean, and what's more, and I think this is a very important point about the way things evolve. I mean, I used to study the American constitutional cases Brown and the Board of Education and so on and so forth. And the fact is, what happened was that the courts, in a sense, reflected, as their decisions changed, the evolution of society. And so certain attitudes held at one time became over time unacceptable attitudes. Now, but here's what I think is important, though. The fact that you had a proper due process and the fact that you had a framework within which these arguments take place, I think is of itself helpful. And that it takes place by reference to an argument that is an argument that in some sense is, I think, morally and not merely contractually inspired. Now, I think, so when I was kind of your age as a student, I used to say, look, really all that's happened is society's changed. But now I take a slightly more sophisticated view of that process and think, yes, it's true, but actually the very fact that there was a process within which these issues were aired and determined that had reference to this constitutional framework of rights was actually very important in resolving this in the correct way. And you might have waited, incidentally, a lot longer for some of these decisions to come right, were it not for that fact. Now, it is, however, a situation in which it does call for open attitudes from the non-religious and the religious. And where you get, for example, a closed attitude on behalf of the religious, you will get the reaction from the non-religious. And that's why this debate, it's quite important that it's seized by what I would say is a sort of sensible and intelligent consensual middle ground to push the extremes back, because let's be very clear about this. The reaction in parts of Europe that has taken on in certain occasions an anti-Islamic character is as a result of the feeling that there are those within the religious faith of Islam who are pushing what people think is an inconsistent view of our basic politics on the rest of the population. So that's why this is why I say, I think this debate, because I really do believe in a sense that for the majority of people, I mean, what Nick has outlined is, I think I think would kind of win the election, as it were. I mean, in other words, most people would say, well, that seems to me sensible enough, because it's a pretty open attitude. But it has to be something that is then, it's the policy conclusion from that interests me. There's how you then inculcate and encourage that, how civic society, not just government, takes a role in that, how academic institutions also develop the research that shows that the open societies can also lead to greater endeavor and prosperity. And I was saying to the colleagues who are here from Peking University today that one really interesting thing to me is in China how the modern leadership is referencing its open policy today, not to the changes of the 60 years since the revolution in China, but actually way back in time to say when Confucianism was developing and China was at that point a very open trading nation. That was when it was successful. It then closed down, became unsuccessful. Now it's opening up again. And I think these things have to be fought for. That's my point. So when you look at the Netherlands, I mean, most people are obviously shocked at what happened, but the only way of retrieving the situation is to try and give some sense of a common space and a common set of shared purposes and values. So, for example, after the London bombing in July 2005, in my first statement, I mean, I knew you would get at a later stage to other things, but my first statement was a statement about shared values, about the fact that any anti-Muslim sentiment coming out of this would be wrong and regressive and undermine the basis of our society. Right. So that was my first, almost kind of like a philosophical political statement to bring people together. But I was also aware, and I got to this a few months later, and people kind of thought one was inconsistent with the other, where I said, right, now we're also going to introduce the following rules. Right? We are not going to have imams coming in from abroad who are not certified by some process as having a certain amount of religious achievement, and also a particular attitude. We can't afford to have someone coming into our society saying you are the enemy if you're not of my religion. So and then people say, well, that's, there's this very nice broad philosophical statement, and now you're taking some quite tough measures here. But I said, no, the one is necessary in order to protect the other. And actually what happens is, and I have this debate often with people on the progressive side of politics, is that such open attitudes and the protection of your basic common space, it doesn't happen by accident, right? And there are plenty of people who will, it might happen naturally, but there are lots of people prepared to interfere with that process. And so you do have to, the policy implications of this, I think, are quite profound and make a lot of difference in the way that politics then interacts with the world of religion.
In a sense, to underscore this point in the Swiss case of the ban, if I'm informed correctly, it is the complacency of the opponents of the ban that allowed the ban to go through. They simply took it for granted that Swiss will not pass the vote, right? So it's a lack of democratic functioning, in a sense, democratic engagement that allowed it to happen.
And I think what happened in the Dutch, my ancestry is Dutch, so I cared about it and so forth. So I think about what happened in the Dutch case and is still happening, is that Holland had become a very homogeneous society. It, for centuries, had a Jewish component, but it had worked out for accommodations, and Jews held honored positions in the society and so forth. And now suddenly, and the Dutch are feeling good about themselves and all of that. Now suddenly there's this group who, in all kinds of ways, is simply not part of the Dutch consensus. They've got no interest in participating in Dutch government. They do get doles from the Dutch government, and this is resented, welfare from the Dutch government, and this is resented, and so forth. So I think American society, and probably British society, would be far better able to handle this new group than the Dutch were. They had no experience with, or such experiences they had was centuries in the past. This was outside the implicit consensus that had emerged.
I amend that by saying I actually think America would have handled this better than either of our.
Okay.
I think European society, I think your very constitution with the points that you're making is one major reason why.
And we're
we've been
much
able to handle
bigger.
these things.
I mean, 15 million homogeneous people. Suddenly you, as opposed to how many do 300 million, whatever, non-homogeneous.